Hi there. So today we're going to talk about angle vocabulary. We've kind of had an introduction to angles thus far, so we're going to go into a little more detail about certain types of angles. So far we've talked about acute, obtuse, right, and straight angles. Today we're going to talk about angles and different vocabulary words that go along with those. So for example, what happens when you have two angles and their sum is 90 degrees? So first thing we're going to talk about is an adjacent angle. An adjacent angle is two angles with the same vertex and one common side. So what that looks like is if you were to have this angle here, it were to share a side with another angle. So see how this side right here is being shared? That is what makes it an adjacent angle. There is no exact measurement for them, so it's just as long as you have two angles that share one side. So another way you may see an adjacent angle looks like that. You may see one that looks like this. An example of no adjacent angles would be as if you had just had two angles that aren't touching. An example of a linear pair, well, the definition is a linear pair is a pair of adjacent angles, so what we just talked about, that form a straight line. So it means that you have two angles that when added together give you 180 degrees or a straight line. Vertical angles are two non-adjacent angles formed by intersecting lines. They are always congruent. So anytime you think you have vertical angles, make sure you trace the lines to make sure that it's one continuous line being intersected by another continuous line. So here when we have these two intersecting lines, you have four angles that are formed. You can say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Here's a diagram. I want to know whether the angles that are given in A through E are only adjacent, adjacent and form a linear pair, vertical angles, or none of the above. So take a look at an angle 2 and 3. What do you notice about these two angles? Do they form a straight line, or do they just share a side? In this example, they just share that one side. Therefore, this is only an adjacent pair. Now take a look at angles 3 and 4. They share a side, but those angles also form a straight line. So because they do that, these are not only adjacent, but they are also a linear pair. Take a look at 1 and 2. These look like vertical angles, but remember you have to have two intersecting lines to form vertical angles. This one is one line, but is this one continuous line? No. Therefore, this is neither. Take a look at 1 and 3. These also look like vertical angles. You have one continuous line here and another there. Therefore, these two angles were formed by two continuous lines that are intersecting, so these are vertical angles. And lastly, QXR, QXR, and 4. They look like, again, vertical angles, but they're not. They're neither. Here's an example of vertical angles. What do you think we can do in order to solve for x? Because that's step 1, solve for x. If you notice, they are two continuous lines, so these two angles are congruent. And if you remember, the word congruent means that they are equal. They are equal. So you can go ahead and set both of those two angles equal to each other to find x. So you would subtract 5x, get 3x plus 2 is equal to 17, subtract 2 and get 3x is equal to 15, divide by 3, so x is 5. The second part, I want to know the measure of angle 1. How can you do that not knowing anything about it? If you notice, you have a straight line or a linear pair. You can take this x is 5 and substitute it back into one of the two equations. So we're going to say 5 times 5 plus 17. And we're doing this to figure out what is the measure of that one angle. So this is 25 plus 17, which gives you 42. This angle here is 42 degrees. Since it forms a straight line, the measure of angle 1 is going to be 180 degrees minus that 42. And that gives you 138 degrees. So the measure of angle 1 is 138 degrees. Here, does anyone know what this box means? That box means that these two angles are going to add up to 90 degrees. So we have nothing that says that it's congruent when we're trying to solve for x, but we know that they're going to add up to 90 degrees. So this is very much like our segment addition, but it's called angle addition. So we know that the whole thing's going to equal 90, so we can go ahead, set these two angles equal to that, and solve. So we have 7x plus 22 is equal to 90. When you subtract 22, you get 7x is equal to 68. Divide by 7, and we get x is 9.7. So what do you think we're going to do with this? We have to figure out the measure of each angle. So you're going to go ahead and take that 9.7 and substitute it back into each angle. So 4 times 9.7 plus 25, and 3 times 9.7 minus 3. So 4 times 9.7 plus 25 gives you 63.8. And 3 times 9.7 minus 3 gives you 26.1. A good way to check your work to see if these answers are the correct ones is to add them together. They should equal 90 degrees. In this case, they're going to equal 89.9, but that's because of the rounding we did once we got 9.7. So here we have a linear pair. And if you notice, a linear pair forms a straight line, and that straight line is equal to 180 degrees. So we're going to use the same concept as we did before by taking our two angles, 15x plus 45 and 10x plus 10, add them together and set it equal to 180 degrees. So what you're going to do is add together your like terms, subtract from 55, you're going to get 125, divide by 25, and x is 5. So just like the previous problem, you're going to take this x is 5 and substitute it into both of the equation, or both of the angles, and figure out what is that angle measure. So the first one, once you simplify, you're going to get 75 plus 45, which is 120. And then this one will simplify to 60 degrees. And again, to double check your answers, it should add up to 180 degrees. This problem here, we've talked about we touched on it. It says this angle here is acute. And it says, what are the restrictions? So ignoring this 4x minus 12, I want to know the restrictions on angle A. What is the lowest angle A can be, and what's the highest angle A can be? We've talked about this. We said the measure has to be bigger than 0, but less than 90. So another way you could write that is this, as a range. I also want to know what are the restrictions on x. So now we have to say, given this equation, what does x have to be? Is it going to be low or is it going to be high? So we would take that 4x minus 12, set it equal to 0, and 4x minus 12 and set it equal to 90. When you go through and solve these problems, x is going to be 3, and x is going to be 25.5. You just found your range. So the measure of x, or the value of x has to be greater than 3, but it can't be higher than 25.5. So your range is x is less than 3, or greater than 3, and less than 25.5. I hope this made sense. Go ahead and move on to your homework. If you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll be around to answer them. Have a great day.